There's an old homestead where my ma and pa were wed, where the world first heard their tiny babies cry. Well, the kids all moved away. It stands deserted there today. But we all go home to visit by and by. Homestead seems much smaller than the one I used to know. The weeds grow tall around the old corral. The traps we'd use in fall hang rustin' on a wall. Grass is growing peaceful round the plow.
Arizona's where we've made our home. Most of us, or our parents, were born someplace else, and so we feel a certain sense of discovery. But people have always discovered Arizona and liked what they saw and decided to stay. I guess there was an Arizona before it was Arizona, before the first homestead, before the Indians, before the cactus in the forests. Before that, there was a beginning. It's taken about 2.5 billion years. More than once there have been upheavals, creating mountains higher than the San Francisco peaks, which gave way to 100 million years of wind and wear. Oceans have come and gone, leaving lakes and forests. Then volcanic eruptions and more upheavals created the mountains we know today, high enough to hold out the rains and create the great deserts in the southern regions. I guess maybe we ought to get one fact straight right from the beginning. The word Arizona does not and never did mean arid zone. Actually, it comes from the Papago Indian word Alishonak, which means the place where the small springs come together. That was the location of a rich silver discovery back in 1736. Between the Spaniards, the Mexicans, and the early American visitors to this part of the country, Alishonak became Arizona. Ironically, Alishonak is located 25 miles south of Nogales in Sonora, Mexico. I'm Bill McCune. Over the years, we Arizonans have been pretty flexible about what you call us. Let's see, we have been Apacheria, Pimeria Alta, the Spanish Empire, the Republic of Mexico, New Mexico Territory, the Confederate Territory of Arizona, Arizona Territory, and the United States of America. Since February 14th, 1912, we've been the state of Arizona. During this program, we want to share with you some stories about the people who have met the challenges and laid the foundation for making us what we are today. Senator Barry Goldwater.
My grandfather came to the junction of the Gila River and the Colorado River in 1860, as always looking for gold, but he didn't find any. But he had a wagon filled with merchandise. So he sold the merchandise to the miners, and that's where we got started in the store business and the trucking business. We wound up trucking freight and mail and supplies to the military posts.
Congressman Morris Udall.
Still, I'm a generation where I can still identify with my grandfather and imagine how things would be and how they suffered. And my kids probably can't, but they ought to have more Arizona history taught.
To these two builders of Arizona, sons of pioneer families, respected statesmen, presidential candidates, men of good humor, treasured assets, we are pleased to dedicate this program.
Well, the cattle all have gone, and the gates are all undone, 'cause there ain't no one there to close 'em anymore. Well, the ranch house is a shambles and the barn is falling down. The termites took the trailer used to haul our horse to town. But the old homestead has memories all around.
It may be that man lived in Arizona millions of years ago. Perhaps someday we'll know. But the earliest people we've found were here about 13,000 BC. Because the remains were found in Cochise County, we call him Cochise Man. But the early man we know best is Hohokam. It is believed he first arrived in southern Arizona along the Gila River about 300 BC. Gradually he moved north, settling in the Salt River Valley in about 700 AD. It's well known that their irrigation canals are still used in Phoenix today, but historian Marshall Trimble says the Hohokam was more advanced than we may realize.
But we know that they had such an advanced culture that this enabled them to get into the fine arts and humanities. They built theaters, they built ballparks, their jewelry making was just phenomenal, the advances these people made. And a culture could only do this if they were well fed and what you might call an affluent, wealthy culture. So the Hohokam were every bit as sophisticated, or maybe more so, as the Europeans of that same period.
But from those places he occupied, he went away. There are theories that they farmed too well and wore out the soil. There is evidence of a 25-year drought. There are theories of epidemics, of wars with predatory tribes. What we know for sure is that they were here, and then they were gone. We think of Arizona history in terms of cowboys and Indians, and it was that. But that era was 350 years after the first Spanish explorers arrived in the 1500s. Finally, the first Spanish colonies were established, like the city of Santa Fe in 1608. It's worth noting that this was 12 years before the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock. The emphasis turned to religion during the next 200 years. The Franciscans tried to build missions among the Hopis, but the Hopis tossed them out in 1680. The Jesuit, Father Kino, was quite successful with the Pimas and the Papagos until his death in 1711. Although 40 years later, the Pimas staged an uprising which led to the building of a fort or presidio at Tubac. Later in 1775, with Apaches causing problems, it was moved a bit north and called Tucson. The Franciscans, under Father Francisco Tomas Garces, worked with Captain Juan Batista de Anza to open a road to Upper California in 1776.
They took colonists. It was like the Lewis and Clark expedition, only they went twice, de Anza did. He took his people, his explorers through there, and then he came back and brought some 200 Spanish colonists. Over 200 Spanish colonists came through with him, and they were actually the first settlers of the city of San Francisco. The original seed population of San Francisco, many of them were born right here in Tubac, Arizona.
Life in Pimeria Alta, as it was called, was not yet genteel. Indeed, Father Garces was killed in an Indian revolt at Yuma in 1781. Well, that decade began the golden years for Spanish settlement. The Apaches agreed to a peace treaty which basically said they'd be peaceful if the Spanish paid them. Great mines were opened, cattle ranches started, and beautiful missions were built. The future looked bright, it would seem, for the Spanish Empire in Arizona. Unfortunately for Spain, the settlers began to view themselves as Mexicans, and they wanted independence. Some efforts began in 1810, but the real revolution came in 1821, and there was established the Republic of Mexico.
Mountain man, mountain man. Bill Williams was a mountain man. He was a trapper and a loner out in northern Arizona, and a roamer through the ponderosa pine. In his buckskin and beard he was feared as he neared, 'cause he moved like a shadow of a line.
At about the same time, the fashion world had an impact on Arizona. Beaver hats became the rage. The Gila River was a prime trapping area, and so there came the mountain men. These trappers were not particularly welcomed.
They found the tribes, many of the tribes, unfriendly. Their presence was not wanted, and their presence was also not wanted by the Mexicans, who feared these interlopers coming in to perhaps maybe take the place away from them. More than that, though, I think they didn't want the American trappers coming in, trapping beaver and smuggling them out, and the Mexicans were not getting their fair share of the taxes on all this.
Mountain man, mountain man. Bill Williams was a mountain man.
A cache of pelts, which would be shipped to St. Louis via the Santa Fe Trail, might take a year to trap. During that time, the mountain man had to survive the dangers of Indians and grizzly bears, flood, storm, and disease. A constant danger was hunger, and they were often reduced to eating things like crickets and worms. At least one mountain man became known as Cannibal Phil after allegedly eating the leg of a former friend. It's said he later survived a blizzard in similar fashion at the expense of his Indian wife.
And some of the people who came in, of course, are legends today. The most famous is Kit Carson, but he was just a youngster. His teacher, his maestro, was a famous trapper by the name of Ewing Young. Among the most famous was Joe Walker, and I think, though, probably maybe the one we remember the best today is Bill Williams. Old Solitary, they called him.
Old Bill Williams was a real loner. Started out as a Methodist missionary, gave that up for trapping, married 2 Indian girls, gave up Christianity for paganism, later became a chief in the Ute tribe, and he was seldom ever near Bill Williams Mountain, which bears his name.
Mountain man, mountain man. Bill Williams was a mountain man.
Texas became a republic in 1836, and 9 years later was admitted to the Union. But the state's western boundary was undefined, and General Zachary Taylor's army was sent in 1846 to seize the disputed territory. The Mexicans, of course, resisted, and with the first American casualty, Congress declared war. In a real sense, it was America's excuse to conquer all of the land extending to the Pacific Ocean. In the course of a year, the Americans captured the entire Southwest and Mexico. The Mexicans, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, gave up for $18 million all of modern-day California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona north of the Gila River. Unfortunately, in the Arizona of 1848, or more correctly, the territory of New Mexico as we were then, everything of value was south of the Gila, the city of Tucson, the road to California, and the best route for a much-needed railroad. With the California gold rush came additional pressure, so in 1853, James Gadsden, America's minister to Mexico, negotiated the Gadsden Purchase, buying our final 29,670 square miles for $10 million. And a footnote, why doesn't Arizona have a seaport? Well, it's not because somebody got drunk and drew the border in the wrong place. It's simply that Mexico would not sell it. In 1849, at least 60,000 Americans headed for California. The gold rush created many demands, the greatest being transportation. Supplies, freight, and people had to be moved, and most passed through Yuma, the one relatively reliable place to cross the Colorado River. Despite the danger of Yuma Indians, Dr. Abel Lincoln started a ferry boat in 1850 and did pretty well until a gang of cutthroats headed by a John Glanton muscled in and added the service of robbing the passengers after they got across the river. Turning to free enterprise, a group of Yuma Indians decided to launch their own ferry boat. But reacting to the challenge, the Glanton gang murdered the competition, literally. Well, the monopoly didn't last long. The Humans staged an ambush and wiped out the Glanton gang, including the otherwise innocent Dr. Lincoln.
Oh, hi, jolly, hey, I gotta be on my way. I told my gal to meet Sunday night.
Transporting freight was the subject of innovation and enterprise. In 1856, there was begun a government experiment using camels to cross the desert. When the mule skinners found the camels temperamental, someone concluded it was because they didn't speak English, so they imported several Arab camel drivers, the best known of which was Haji Ali, or more commonly known, Hi Jolly. The camels actually did pretty well, but the Civil War ended the experiment. California was booming and citizens were demanding better transportation and mail service. One system was called the Jackass Mail. It was not very successful, as a passenger had to ride 180 miles across the desert on the back of a mule.
Hi, Jolly, hey, Jolly, hi, oh, Bertha.
Real success came in 1858 with John Butterfield's Overland Mail and Stage Line. In less than 1 year, Butterfield developed more than 150 depots, bought some 1,500 horses and mules, and established a route covering 2,800 miles from Tipton, Missouri to San Francisco.
It wasn't a comfortable trip. It was maybe 24 days of real hard riding in a rig with no shock absorbers, no deodorant pads, no toothbrushes. It got pretty rotten and miserable, and they say the best way to do it in those days was to drink your way across. If you could stay drunk all the way from Tipton, Missouri to San Francisco, I guess the ride wouldn't have been so bad.
Imagine one of John Butterfield's bleary-eyed passengers approaching Yuma, and not only seeing a caravan of camels, but seeing their cargo being loaded onto a steamboat. Well, he might have thought it was the whiskey, but in fact there were steamboats on the Colorado River for nearly 50 years. It began in 1852. Within a few years, stern-wheelers ran from such port cities as Hardyville, Ehrenberg, and Yuma, down the Sea of Cortez, around the Baja Peninsula, and up to San Francisco. The practice continued until 1908, when construction of Laguna Dam, just north of Yuma, brought an end to an era. Hollywood movies emphasized the white man infringing on the Indians' native land. And that was certainly true, but it was a bit less true in the case of the Apaches. They were a nomadic people who had arrived from Canada just prior to the Spanish explorers. Like the Navajos, they were raiders who plundered other tribes and even engaged in a kind of slave trade. The name Apache in some tribal languages is said to mean enemy. Spanish and Mexicans merely provided more targets for the Apache to raid. Out of frustration in the 1830s, the Mexican government started offering $100 per Apache scalp. The problem, however, was that less than reputable bounty hunters were selling as many Mexican scalps as Apache. The American military in old Arizona was a mixed bunch. Immigrants, adventurers, troublemakers. The Army asked few questions. Life was pretty boring and dangerous, mostly boring. Alcohol and suicide were problems. Deserters, when captured, were sometimes branded with the letter D on their posteriors. Still, desertion rates were as high as 1/3, except among the black units known as Buffalo Soldiers, where desertion was rare. Men were required to take 1 bath a week, about which one fella commented, "It wasn't so bad, everyone smelled the same." It was not glamorous, but it served the purpose of keeping things reasonably under control. Then in January of 1861, there occurred the Bascom affair near Apache Pass. A young white boy was kidnapped, presumably by Indians. Army Lieutenant George Bascom took as hostages 3 relatives of the Apache chief Cochise, pending the boy's release. Cochise claimed no knowledge of the boy, but angered, he went out and got 3 American hostages of his own, killing some other Americans and several Mexicans in the process. He had Bascom's troops surrounded, and though he stuck to his story about the boy, he suggested they trade hostages. Bascom refused, and it was a standoff. A rescue force led by Army Surgeon Bernard Irwin arrived at Bascom's camp. En route, they had engaged in battle and brought 3 more Apache captives. But by this time, Cochise's band had lost patience. They killed their hostages and left. Over Lieutenant Bascom's protests, Irwin and some other senior officers determined that their 6 Apache scouts should be executed. Near the graves of the dead Americans, they were hanged and left hanging for several months. For his rescue effort, Dr. Irwin won America's earliest recorded Congressional Medal of Honor. Lieutenant Bascom was killed in the Civil War. Cochise, who had been relatively peaceful up to that time, spent the next 10 years on a very bloody warpath.
Way down yonder in the land of cotton, old times there are not forgotten. Look away.
Ironically, a factor that contributed to Apache violence was the outbreak of the Civil War. Virtually all of the federal troops in the West were ordered east to defend the Union, a situation Cochise didn't understand but took advantage of. When it comes right down to it, Arizona's role in the Civil War was pretty insignificant. We were, for a time, part of the Confederacy. At least Tucson was. Folks in Tucson didn't resist. What with the Apache problem, they were delighted to have any army back in town.
Not all of the citizens were. There were many loyal to the Union, and they were asked to leave. It's kind of an interesting story about a couple of them. They were told, some of them fled to Mexico, others were just said, go. And they were given maybe a revolver and a rifle and told to ride right through the middle of Apache country and get out of there. Some went to California, but if you weren't going to swear allegiance to the Confederacy, they wanted you out of town by sundown.
Around her neck, she wore a yellow ribbon, wore it for her lover.
There were 2 or 3 skirmishes, but only the battle at Picacho Peak north of Tucson was notable. A scouting party of Confederates were camped there, although only 3 were in the camp at the time. An advanced element of the Union's California column happened along. A few shots were fired, and the rebels were captured. While they were being tied up, the larger Confederate force returned and opened fire. The Union leader, Lieutenant Barrett, and 2 of his troops were killed. 4 others were wounded.
And when it was all over, when the smoke had cleared, the Confederates had retreated from the field, and the Union troops retreated from the field, so in a sense you could call it kind of a standoff, but it gave the Confederates time to get to Tucson and warn their commanding officer, Captain Sherrod Hunter, that the large Union army was coming and it was time to evacuate Tucson. And really that ended the Confederate experience here in Arizona.
Look away, Dixieland.
For nearly a dozen years, folks in Arizona wanted to be a territory separate from New Mexico. A few years earlier, in 1860, a group in Tucson declared it a territory and even elected a Dr. Lewis Owings as governor, but nobody really took that very seriously. Of course, it had been a separate territory of the Confederacy. Then when the federal troops reoccupied Tucson, General James Carleton proclaimed Arizona a territory of the Union. Congress made it official on February 24th, 1863. The first governor, John Goodwin, set up a temporary capital in Chino Valley, the site of Fort Whipple, then moved it down the road to Granite Creek. A Capitol building was erected, and the whole place was renamed Prescott.
Another place, another time, crossed that reservation line, about 100 years behind. Hold on. Winter time is bitter cold, losing lives of sick and old. There's a better life, I'm told. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your hand on that plow. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your hands on that plow. Hold on.
With the Confederates gone, the Army had new orders: exterminate all Indians. Some Navajos were still raiders, but many others had taken up farming and sheep raising. Nevertheless, for 6 months, Colonel Kit Carson, following orders, scorched the earth, burning the Navajos' corn and wheat fields, killing or capturing their sheep and goats, destroying their homes and possessions.
Hold on. Keep your hands.
8,000 Navajo prisoners, men, women, and children, took the long walk, 400 miles through the winter, to a prison reservation at Bosque Redondo, New Mexico, picked punitively because it was so desolate and useless. Many died.
Looking in my children's eyes shows the hardships of their lives. Not a single baby cries. Hold on. Kids are kids, both red and white, in the things they want and like. Put a smile upon that tyke. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your hand on that plow. Hold on.
After 5 agonizing years, they were allowed to walk again, another 400 miles back to the Four Corners area, not unlike Bosque Redondo, where they have continued to live, some not unlike Bosque Redondo.
How alcohol and suicide shows the pain I try to hide. Won't you help me turn the tide and hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your hand on that plow, hold on, hold on. Keep your hand on that plow, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your hand on that plow. Hold on. Right along the old Crook Trail in a song.
Apaches were sometimes victims. In 1871, some of Tucson's leading citizens, under cover of darkness, snuck into a peaceful reservation village at Camp Grant. Using clubs and knives for silence, they slaughtered 132 sleeping Apache women and children. 27 others were sold in Mexico as slaves. President Grant called it murder and ordered a trial. It took the jury 19 minutes to say not guilty. In the wake of the outrage, the military leadership was reorganized under General George Crook. His approach was honest and humane treatment of peaceful Indians and relentless pursuit of hostile bands. If Crook had a secret weapon, it was the Apache Scout, who hired on at military pay, giving the Army a knowledge of terrain and hostile movements they'd never had before. In December 1872, the Scouts led soldiers to positions above and below the high cliffs that overlook modern-day Horse Mesa Dam. Remote caves there hid the notorious band of Nani Chadi. Called to surrender, the Apaches jeered. From below, the troops ricocheted bullets off the ceiling of the caves. From above, the troops literally threw boulders down. After 5 hours, 76 Apaches died. A few weeks later, another 40 resistant Apaches were killed at Turret Butte in Bloody Basin. Apache resistance in the Tonto Basin was ended, and within 2 months, 2,300 of them settled somewhat content on a reservation at Camp Verde. In southeastern Arizona, an aging Cochise made peace, with the understanding that his people could inhabit as a reservation the Chiricahua Mountains where they already lived. The Apache Wars weren't over, but it was headed that way, until 1874, when government bureaucrats, over Crook's objections, made a decision to move virtually all Apaches to a single reservation at San Carlos, which was also known as Hell's 40 Acres. But politics and corruption interfered. As employees stole supplies that were meant for the Indians, Apache bands bolted the reservation and went back to raiding. Then in 1875, General Crook was transferred to Wyoming. The situation deteriorated. Over the next several years, hostiles raided on a large scale. Victorio, who was a brilliant tactician with 300 warriors, is reported to have killed more than 1,000 people in Arizona, Mexico, and New Mexico during 1879 and 80. Finally, in 1882, General Crook was returned to command. And one of his first actions was to expose corrupt reservation agents and suppliers known as the Indian Ring. The scandal reached all the way to officials in Washington and was largely cleaned up. Over the next 3 years, Crook's army, with the aid of Chiricahua Apache scouts, fought various Chiricahua renegades, including the most cunning leader, Geronimo. Crook reasoned that if Geronimo would surrender, the others would follow. In February of 1884, Crook convinced Geronimo to do just that. Until May of 85, there was a tense peace. Then, in a dispute over reservation rules, Geronimo, with perhaps 15 Chiricahua warriors, bolted again to Mexico. It is significant that only small numbers followed Geronimo, as he was viewed as a bit of a rebel without a cause. Most Chiricahuas and virtually all other Apaches realized the futility of the old ways. Meanwhile, in Washington, Army Chief General Phil Sheridan called for an end to Crook's use of Chiricahua scouts and his approach to pursuing hostiles. Knowing it was the only effective method, Crook refused to change and offered to be relieved of duty. he was replaced by the politically ambitious General Nelson Miles. Determined to please Washington, Miles dismissed almost all of the scouts and established a more traditional military structure. He had 5,000 troops, 20% of the entire U.S. Army, looking for 16 hostile Apaches. Ironically, it was a protege of General Crook, Lieutenant Charles Gatewood, accompanied by 2 Chiricahua scouts, Cayeta and Martine, who at great risk of their lives located Geronimo's camp and convinced him to surrender for the final time. The Apache Wars were over. On September 3rd, 1886, at Skeleton Canyon, General Miles promised Geronimo that after 2 years in a Florida prison, he and his people would be allowed to return to Arizona and live peacefully. True to his ambitions, General Miles publicized himself nationally as the man who captured Geronimo. The real hero of the event, Lieutenant Gatewood, was shipped out to Wyoming and never given any recognition. Today there's a movement among historians to award Gatewood the Congressional Medal of Honor. General Miles had other surprises up his sleeve. All of the Chiricahuas, including those who had adopted peaceful ways on the reservation, were shipped off to the Florida prison. This even included the 2 or 3 dozen scouts who had been faithful employees of the U.S. Army. The 2-year prison term, in fact, became a 27-year confinement in Oklahoma. For many years, General Crook worked without success for the Chiricahuas' release. He died in 1890. Geronimo, as an old man, was allowed to become quite a celebrity in Wild West shows. Once spotting General Miles in the audience, he went into the crowd and tried to kill him. As for Miles' career, he was commanding general of the Army during the 1898 war with Spain. When more soldiers died from food poisoning than bullets, his White House dreams were usurped by a colleague who charged up San Juan Hill. Miles was unceremoniously retired.
The abuse that the American Indian has taken is not something that our nation should be proud of. And that abuse has not stopped by any means at all.
And when the judge took his seat, the bailiff again rapped the gavel. Everybody sat down except this one rather strange individual that stood in awe sort of out in front of the judge's bench. And finally old Hawkins leaned over his bench and he said, "Pardon me, sir, but are you the defendant in this case?" He says, "No, Your Honor, I'm the guy that stole the horse."
Despite the threat of hostile Apaches, most Arizonans were busy building a territory. As Budge Ruffner just described, there was a judicial system geared to the less than sophisticated. In Tombstone of the 1880s, all of the lawyers had their offices on one street, which was affectionately known as Rotten Row. One of those lawyers penned his own epitaph: "Here lies a good man, a lover of fast horses, pretty women, and good whiskey." But Marcus Aurelius Smith didn't die right away. He went on to serve in the United States Senate. I guess my favorite character of that era was C. Myers Zulick, the first Democratic territorial governor of Arizona. When word came that President Cleveland had appointed him, Zulick, the lawyer, was nowhere to be found. In fact, he was in a Mexican jail in Cananea, being held ransom for payment of one of his client's debts. Well, the next night, a fellow named Donovan, sort of a 19th century Rambo, snuck across the border, took some dynamite, blew off the back of the jail, and brought him back to Arizona for a quick inauguration. And then there was the 13th Territorial Legislature of 1889.
Thieving 13th legislature. Well, they were bandits. They were crooks. And they took advantage of every situation. They go home to Phoenix, for example, from Prescott by way of Los Angeles. They are those who are rumored to have gone to Tucson via New Orleans. Things like that. They were irresponsible.
Bitch, you know it just don't do no good. Oh, bitch, but the talk about it sure feels good.
One of the amazing things about cowboys is that you can compare a picture of one today with a picture from 100 years ago, and they look just alike. Their work is as hard, they get just as sore, and their complaints are about the same.
Rattle in the saddle while gathering the cattle. I've been trotting till my butt's all gone. I've been eating up the dust till my voice has turned to rust. Now it gravels when I sing my song. I've been a-working in the weather till my hide has turned to leather. My lips are chapped, my hands are hard. I've been a-loading in the chutes till I'm dragging both my boots, cause my aching body's so damn tired. Bitch, 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 you know it just don't do no good. Oh, bitch, 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 but to talk about it so it feels good.
The cowboy, folk hero, a folk hero. Amazingly enough, probably the most stable folk hero we've ever had. He has hung on to his image and still is the hero of the child longer than any other kind of hero I can recall. The astronaut never did replace him. He got some attention, but he never totally replaced the cowboy.
The Arizona cowboy and rancher was more than colorful. He was a builder of the economically important livestock industry. While he was punching cows, others were punching cash registers. Arizona was growing up and consumers wanted merchandise. Families such as the Goldwaters and the Babbitt brothers built successful businesses and met the demand by importing goods from San Francisco and the East Coast. Of course, others tried to make their fortunes in less honorable ways. Dr. Richard Flower did okay selling cure-all medicine. But in that it was mostly alcohol, nobody felt cheated. His problems came when he started selling shares in a phony gold mine east of Globe. It was appropriately called the Spindazuma. But the greatest schemer of all was James Addison Rivas, known for a time in the 1880s as the Baron of Arizona. Rivas spent a decade forging documentation of a phony Spanish land grant, claiming nearly 18,000 square miles of central Arizona as his personal property. It was valued at $100 million. That was back in the days when $100 million was a lot of money. He lived like a baron, selling land to folks who already owned it, but weren't sure. Ultimately, the scheme was unraveled and Rivas went to prison for less than 2 years. If the baron's fortune was not legitimate, there were others whose fortunes were, and they came about through a lot of sweat, determination, and luck. Their wealth was there for the digging, and a good example was Ed Shefflin, who started prospecting at about the age of 12. By the time he was 24, he looked a weather-beaten 40 and had nothing to show for it. In 1877, his search for the mother lode brought him to southeastern Arizona. Everyone with sense had just left, as the Apache Victorio had just begun his ruthless spree. The local soldiers told Ed Shefflin that the only thing he'd find in that desert was his tombstone, and indeed he did. A bit east of the San Pedro River and a bit north of the Mule Mountains, Ed staked mining claims to which he gave such colorful names as the Lucky Cuss, the Tough Nut, and Contention. The town that sprung up nearby was, of course, Tombstone. A single ton of ore from those mines produced $15,000 in silver, and as a bonus, another $1,500 in gold. Ed Shefflin was rich. He built a mansion in San Francisco, traveled extensively, and hobnobbed with America's wealthy elite. But there was something about prospecting, wandering the deserts and mountains alone, looking for another find that he couldn't get out of his blood. Don't worry, Ed Shefflin didn't give away his fortune. He was no fool. He just left it from time to time, back to the hills. He died a natural death in 1897, alone in a prospector's cabin, probably happy. A prospector making a strike didn't have the money to develop a real mining operation, so they often turned to Eastern financiers. Henry Wickenburg sold out his Vulture mine for $85,000. Ultimately, it produced more than $20 million. Sadly, Wickenburg died penniless, a suicide, in the town that bears his name. I guess what really started to bring Arizona into the civilized world was the railroad. Yuma in 1877 boasted the first rail into the state. In 1880, when Tucson was linked up, they telegraphed news of the event to the Pope in Rome. A reply, supposedly signed by His Holiness, said, "Congratulations, but where in the hell is Tucson?" Our greatest railroad man was Frank Murphy, who built a line from Prescott to Crown King in the rugged Bradshaw Mountains.
Prescott was economically in big trouble. They had lost the capital. Everything was at a slowdown, and all of a sudden this entrepreneur named Frank Murphy came in, and he was a real gambler, and he built this line that they said, you can never get a railroad into those Bradshaw Mountains. And Frank Murphy says, I'll show you we can.
Frank Murphy's impossible Bradshaw Mountain Railroad. They said it couldn't be built, that wouldn't wilt or wither his plan. And he proved them all wrong when his train chugged along with its payload. Frank Murphy's impossible Bradshaw Mountain Railroad. Some said he was crazy and his logic was hazy, and he thought through a hole in his hat. Frank Murphy was counting to build a track up the mountain. He ought to be smarter than that. So he blasted and drilled through the mountains and hills. He shoveled and he tunneled away. The folks in Crown King were all cheering and singing when his train reached the top on that day. Frank Murphy's impossible Bradshaw Mountain Railroad. They said it couldn't be built, that wouldn't wilt or wither his plan. And he proved them all wrong when his train chugged along with its payload. Frank Murphy's impossible Bradshaw Mountain Railroad. Frank Murphy's incredible, most unforgettable, not quite impossible, Bradshaw Mountain Railroad. Pleasant Valley, Dead Man Alley, that's the Pleasant Valley War.
At the time of a series of episodes called the Pleasant Valley War, Arizona was raw, unpopulated, certainly civilized in the sense that we think of it today.
Ed Tewksbury and Tom Graham were friends, and they were in the cattle business together. But eventually, the Graham and Tewksbury families got into a serious disagreement over the ownership of brands and cows.
There were quarrels, there were shootings, angry words, and eventually deaths. And by the time this was all over a course of about 35 years, as many as provably, demonstrably, 30 men lost their lives, and maybe as many as 50. It got to be the kind of place that if you were a stranger and you were so incautious as to ride across, taking a shortcut from Holbrook to Phoenix, you just might be waylaid by either side.
And they played mean. When Bill Jacobs brought some sheep into the valley, he found his shepherd beheaded, presumably by the Grahams. Mort Blevins disappeared one night. His body was never found, presumably at the hands of the Tewksburys. One of the better-known events occurred in September 1887. The Graham faction arrived at the Tewksbury cabin on Cherry Creek.
Pleasant Valley, Dead Man Alley, that's the Pleasant Valley War.
John Tewksbury and Bill Jacobs were ambushed and left where they fell.
The Graham faction then could turn their guns upon the cabin itself. The cabin, by the way, still stands in Pleasant Valley and is full of bullet holes. They must have laid down quite a hail of fire against the cabin. And by some accounts, this battle raged for several days. I doubt that, but it certainly went on for quite a while. And I suppose the Grahams were hoping that they were going to be able to annihilate the Tewksbury family then and there.
There's a story that during the battle, wild domesticated swine began to gnaw on the body of John Tewksbury. The shooting stopped as his widow rushed out with a shovel and buried him. Her job done, the battle began again. And then there's the opposite story.
The effect of it was to begin the legend that the Grahams would not let the Tewksburys out to bury their dead. And it took about 35 years for this family hatred, this terrible revenge to burn itself out, and eventually just about by the deaths of all who were involved. I went to Vietnam twice. I never understood a thing about it. And yet, in human scale and in numbers, I can understand how the Pleasant Valley War began and how it evolved, and then how it didn't make very much sense, and how if there had been more kindness and thought and accommodation and negotiation in the beginning, it probably never would have happened. It makes me wonder about all wars, big or small.
Pleasant Valley, Dead Man Alley, that's the Pleasant Valley War.
Bringing law and order to the West was a real challenge, and our image of the frontier sheriff is probably not very accurate.
The sheriff was the whole spread. He was the tax collector, the process server, frequently the treasurer of the county. He did it all. He conducted the whole thing, and he certainly was in control of the criminal element.
Many were paid on commission. So much for an arrest, so much for a hanging. It was confrontational. We've all heard of Wyatt Earp of Tombstone fame, but an even more flamboyant character was Sheriff Commodore Perry Owens of Navajo County. A few days after the murders at the Tewksbury cabin, Sheriff Owens went to a house in Holbrook to arrest some of the Blevins men and Andy Cooper, who'd been involved in the shootout.
Very perfunctorily asked for Andy Cooper to surrender. Cooper did not, maybe gave him a little static. I'd like to pack. I'd like to wait a minute. No, wait, he said, I shot him. And he shot him. And in the next 30 seconds, 3 Blevins men were killed, and a 4th was seriously wounded. It probably, in the West, history of the Western gunfighter, law officer, is the bloodiest 30-second episode perpetrated by one man.
I see very little difference between the outlaw and the lawman in old Arizona. It's just one was good with a gun and he was on one side, and one was good with a gun and he was on the other side. And I don't know how they happen to have made their choice, but I see both of them as really desperados. Just one was a good guy and one was a bad guy.
Sometimes that fine line between good and bad guy was crossed, as when the constable from Wilcox robbed the Southern Pacific train in 1899. Some folks were calling for a territorial police force. So in 1901, there was created the Arizona Rangers. Under Captain Burt Mossman, the Rangers arrested 125 major criminals during its first year. One of Teddy Roosevelt's former Rough Riders, Tom Reining, took over from 1902 to 1907. During that period, the Rangers several times found themselves in the dubious role of strikebreakers for corporate mining interests. On one occasion, they found themselves quite illegally involved in a mine labor dispute south of the border in Cananea, Sonora, Mexico. Reining's administration also had a reputation for vindictiveness. A certain deputy sheriff who'd never been out of Arizona was arrested for a murder that had been committed 3 years earlier on a ship in the South Pacific. Harry Wheeler, the final ranger captain, tried very hard to restore the group's credibility. During his years as a ranger, he had personally killed 4 outlaws in face-to-face gunfights. As captain, his emphasis was to get the Rangers back to chasing the bad guys. By 1909, the guild was off the lily. Local sheriffs resented the Arizona Rangers. Some felt they were too closely tied to the Republican Party. When the Democrats took overwhelming control of the legislature, the Arizona Rangers were simply voted out of existence. It was a new century, and Arizona wanted statehood. They'd already refused to accept the proposal of joint statehood with New Mexico. Why should they? Arizona had everything: cattle, cotton, citrus, copper, and climate. We had a university, a normal school, a new prison, and an insane asylum. What else could you need? It's said that after the Civil War, General Sherman visited here, and someone said to him, "General, all Arizona needs is some good people and more water." General Sherman responded, "Son, that's all hell needs." The people came on their own. The water took some effort. In 1867, Jack Swilling took the first step, establishing an irrigation company in a town called Hill City, later renamed Phoenix, on the canals of the Hohokam. 35 years later, Congress took the next step, loaning the people of the Salt River Valley $11 million to build Theodore Roosevelt Dam. Begun in 1905 and completed in 1911, TR himself came for the dedication. Others followed: Horse Mesa, Mormon Flat, Stewart Mountain on the Salt River, as well as Bartlett and Horseshoe on the Verde River. If these dams had not been built, the population of the entire Salt River Valley would probably have never grown beyond 100,000 people, and they would have been pretty hard-pressed for electricity. But they were built, and with them came a stable water supply for agriculture and electricity for people. And with this new modern Arizona came the inventions of convenience, including the automobile. The automobile for work, the automobile for pleasure, and the automobile for racing. There were no superhighways. To publicize the need for better roads, each year from 1908 to 1917, there was held the Cactus Derby, a test of man and machine, from Los Angeles to Phoenix, sometimes via San Diego and Yuma, other years through Needles and Prescott. Among the drivers who participated were Barney Oldfield and Lewis Chevrolet. February 14, 1912, President William Howard Taft signed the bill making Arizona the 48th state. Waiting in the wings was an amazing man, our first governor, Democrat George W.P. Hunt. Hunt served 7 two-year terms as chief executive, but not in a row. You might say he was every other governor during the first 21 years of statehood. In the 1916 election, it looked like he'd lost to Republican Tom Campbell by 30 votes. Hunt contested, and on New Year's Day, each man held his own inauguration and had himself sworn in as governor. Governor Hunt refused to vacate the office at the Capitol. Governor Campbell set up a governor's office in his kitchen. The state treasurer and auditor were both Democrats and refused to honor any checks that Governor Campbell signed. It looked like Hunt had the upper hand, although when the legislature met, both governors went and gave a State of the State address. Finally, Judge R.C. Stanford, who 15 years later would himself be governor, ruled that Campbell had won the election. Campbell moved into the capital and for several months carried out the duties. That is until December 22, 1917, when the state Supreme Court reversed Judge Stanford's decision and ruled once and for all that Hunt was in fact the governor. But don't worry about Tom Campbell. He was elected governor in his own right in 1919, when George W.P. Hunt accepted President Wilson's appointment as minister to Siam. Building Arizona was a tough job. Men had to be pretty rugged. But you know, there were a lot of women who made important contributions as well. Here are just a few who have been inducted into the Arizona Women's Hall of Fame. Nellie Bush, who was a commercial airline pilot, lawyer, legislator, riverboat captain, city attorney, and a lot more. Rachel Berry of St. John's, who in 1912 became the first woman in America to be elected to a state House of Representatives. Frances Munns of Prescott, America's second woman state senator. She led the effort for women in Arizona to have the right to vote and won in 1912, 8 years before the rest of the nation. Sally Davis Hayden, a real civic leader and the mother of U.S. Senator Carl Hayden, who served in Congress longer than any other American. And Jane Ryder, the first woman engineering graduate at the University of Arizona, who led many battles in the state for enactment of health and sanitation laws. And there's another group that should not be overlooked, the Mormon pioneers. Morris Udall's ancestors were among those early settlers.
About St. John's and Snowflake and these places, it's the winters are cold and the summers are hot, and the land wasn't really all that productive. But you had to have a lot of qualities: hard work, strong religious faith, willingness to pitch in and help other people. I just can't express my admiration too much for the ancestors I have and the people who came with them to northern Arizona. There aren't many places that would be tougher to put down a settlement.
Of course, Mo Udall wouldn't be Mo Udall without a story to share.
The fellow went to heaven, and he got along with St. Peter, and after a while he said he'd like to see hell. He'd heard a lot about it, and they took him down to this back stairway, and they went in, and there were trees growing everywhere, and it looked really pretty nice place. And the fellow said to St. Peter, "What's happened here?" You explained how hot and miserable hell was. And he said, "Well, it's those damn Mormons. They've been irrigating again."
With the modern era, there came to Arizona a new industry. Everyone loves John Wayne, but long before there was John Wayne, there was another star of the horse opera filmed in Arizona. His name was Tom Mix.
But when I was a boy, he made a number of movies in Prescott. I can recall a site that he made a movie out at the old Bar Circle A Ranch. That was the old, what they call a Tom Mix Ranch. Extremely glamorous individual with the big white Stetson and so forth. We went out with our fathers one Sunday to watch him shoot this scene that Tom Mix was going to do. But he riding his horse Tony, and his hat blew off and fell to the ground. And he spun the horse around, went back at a lope, leaned down off the saddle low, picked up the hat off the ground and put it back on. All these kids in Prescott thought that was the most romantic thing in the world. What a great gesture. And of course we tried it the next few days with our ponies and burros and so forth. And most of the kids that tried it had a broken collarbone or broken arm. But they all gave it a whirl.
1917, while America was at war in Europe, Phelps Dodge Mining was at war in Bisbee, Arizona.
I was born in Bisbee town on the edge of the pit mine field. All day long I could hear the song of the rumble of the ore cart wheel. So dig ye down in the dark, dark ground where the sunlight never shines. I'll live my life in Bisbee town and I'll die in the deep, dark mine.
They were charged with getting the copper to support the Allied cause. Now, mining company profits were skyrocketing, and wages were just kind of holding their own. So labor saw this as an opportunity to go for higher wages. And there was one real radical union called the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. Their nickname was the Wobblies, and they were kind of the boogeymen of the unions at the time. And in order to set an example, the company armed a large number of, let's call them vigilantes or posse, and early one morning they began a roundup of every suspected union agitator, close to 2,000 before the morning was out, marched them off to the ballpark and incarcerated them there, and then gave them a chance to repent their sins. But over 1,000 of them were loaded on railroad cars and literally railroaded out of Arizona.
Dig ye down in the dark, dark brown and dig your life away. Your face and hands turn black as coal and your hair turns iron or gray.
The train took them out to Columbus, New Mexico, out in the desert, just east of the Arizona-New Mexico line, and they dumped them off there. And of course, fortunately, there was an army post because the soldiers fed them and took care of them. Very few of those people who were railroaded out ever returned to Bisbee. It's such a bitter issue that to this day it can still stir an argument among the sons and grandsons of management people and laboring people in Arizona.
I'll live my life in Bisbee town and I'll die in the deep dark mine.
Civil liberties were violated there, and I believe that was the bottom line. I believe it was wrong.
We thought we'd share one last story with you. It's a true story, probably a bit exaggerated. It's not a terribly important story as far as Arizona history is concerned. Maybe its value is in knowing the spirit of the man who it's about.
Well, his name was Paddy Murphy. He was Irish through and through. He came from Mother Ireland, crossed the ocean wide and blue. He was kinda wild and woolly and the crazy things he'd do. How he loved his Irish whiskey and the biplane that he flew.
It was 1929, and Mexico was involved in yet another attempt at revolution.
Being an Irishman, he really loved the spirit of a revolutionist.
Patrick Murphy wanted to get involved, and it was at about that time that he met the General. The General was the commander of the revolutionary forces, but he knew in his heart that one day he would become El Presidente. Patrick Murphy, on the other hand, had no such glorious ambitions. Did we mention the General's automobile? Well, like so many great leaders, he had an affinity for the finer things, and there was nothing he loved more than his automobile.
Say down's another shooter. Patrick Murphy starts to brag. I support the rebel spirit. I salute them scallywags. Whack and bomb them federales all the way to kingdom come. From the cockpit of me biplane, I could toss me homemade bomb.
The revolution wasn't going so well. The General's army was surrounded in the little border town of Naco, Sonora. So the General and Patrick Murphy made a deal.
He decided that he'd make some homemade bombs and bomb the hell out of the federales and give these revolutionists a little helping hand. See, there's two Nacos. One's on the north side of the border in Arizona, one's on the south side in Mexico.
As was the popular entertainment of the day, the General drove to Naco, Arizona, so he could get a good vantage point to watch the action. Unfortunately, that day, things just weren't going as planned. The General began to realize that something was terribly wrong.
Now Murphy and his whiskey weren't too accurate that day. He missed the one in Mexico and bombed the USA.
The trouble was, he'd been nipping his Irish whiskey a little too much, and he got a little confused.
America, the other in Mexico. Now Murphy and his whiskey weren't too accurate that day. He missed
And when
the
he flew
water.
over, he bombed the wrong NACO, and he bombed the United States of America, which was not a nice thing to do.
God cried out the village of the old red, white, and blue. He's gonna kill us all, cried the feds and rebel too. Someone shoot him down, it's the only thing to do. A federale hit his plane and Murphy's war was through. Now history doesn't know where Patrick Murphy is today. When he finally sobered up, he kinda quickly went away. Yes, he faded with his biplane to some other place and time. For to bomb old Arizona was a heavy-duty crime. So lads, go tell your father and your sisters and your moms the moral of this story that I've sung you in me song. That in all the U.S. wars from Valley Forge to Vietnam, it's the only time in history the mainland has been bombed. That's Patrick Murphy and his war.
Bringing you this show on Arizona history has really been a labor of love for us. It was produced to help celebrate our Diamond Jubilee, the 75th anniversary of Arizona's statehood. But I hope it's still seen and enjoyed in the year 2012 when we celebrate our centennial. That's a neat thing about history. It never gets out of date. I know there were a lot of Arizona people and events that we didn't get to. That's one of the frustrations of having limited time. On the other hand, there's nothing to prevent you from reading about Arizona and her colorful past on your own time. I know you'll enjoy it. Adios.
In Arizona, Spanish say adios, and the red man hollers you up the hay. And a man knows a man by the shaking of his hand. That's the Arizona way, my friends, the Arizona way. We're living the legends of the great Southwest, and our hearts grow prouder every day. And we'll sing our song as we travel along, the Arizona way, my friend, the Arizona way. From Father Kino to Carl Hayden's name, sing of men and women bold and brave. Sing for you, sing for me, sing for love and loyalty of the Arizona way, my friend, the Arizona way. In Arizona, Spanish say adios, and the red man hollers you up the hay. And a man knows a man by the shaking of his hand. That's the Arizona